In this video, I am focusing on Birgitta of Sweden and Catherine of Siena. They were both heavily involved in both secular and religious politics, and they both occupy a fascinating space in the late medieval period. These two women were very different, but they somehow operated in the world in a surprisingly similar way. Both were able to leverage their mystical experiences to establish themselves as prophets, basically. They each entered into public life, and they were deeply involved, in the church politics of the day, and especially Birgitta in other political situations as well. And they were both involved in trying to bring the Pope back to Rome, because this is the time with the Avignon papacy, if you remember that whole ordeal from History 1. Okay, so I'm going to start with Birgitta. She's quite a bit older than Catherine. She was born a member of the Swedish aristocracy. She was the daughter and wife of prominent, the position was called a lawman in Sweden at the time, which was a pretty prominent position. And she was associated with the royal court. She was very well connected. For the most part, or for the first part of her life, she lived a pretty typical, existence for an aristocratic woman. She married young. I think she was like 14. She had a number of children. She was apparently quite religious, but she was a lay person. All right. Birgitta was in her 40s when she was widowed, and this is the point where things radically change for her. She has this religious vision shortly after her husband's death, in which basically God specifically calls her to be a mouthpiece for him. All right, this is different from most of the other mystics that we're reading. This is different from a lot of other mystical experiences that we've seen throughout this whole course. In fact, that is why I think the term prophet might actually be more accurate for her, and that's really the way she functioned within society. And indeed, her Vita, or the kind of writing about her for the promotion of veneration, refers to her true spirit of prophecy and her kind of intellectual visions. All right. She did not write tracts about loving God like Bernard, or coming closer like God. She really did function as a mouthpiece. All right. And that is a position that not everyone enjoyed, all right, or accepted. All right, so because of the nature of her particular call, she did not retire to a convent, which may have been kind of the more expected route for somebody in her position. She did, however, move to the grounds of a men's Cistercian monastery for a while. And of course, she didn't join the order because it was a men's house. And she probably had limited access to the buildings on the ground too. And her presence was pretty much not welcomed by the monks until one of the men in the community had a mystical experience himself, and then told everybody that this was God's desire, and that she would bring a renewal to spiritual life in the community, kind of thus sanctifying her presence there. Though she doesn't stay there forever, she eventually leaves. So Birgitta continues to have visions through the rest of her life. Many of these were concerning public affairs, issues of the state, different religious abuses. Kind of an interesting one is she had a vision and sent a message to Pope Clement VI to arrange peace between France and England, who were in the throes of the 100 Years' War. This was unsuccessful, and the war continued for about another century. Another thing of note, when her own king led a crusade against the Russians, she had a vision justifying his action. However, when the crusade proved unsuccessful and the Swedish nobility rose up against the king, she sided with the nobility and wrote a condemnation of the king. All right, so not everything was panning out for her in all regards here. But she was operating kind of fully in her role as a prophet when the plague hit Europe. And in fact, 1349, when things are really quite bad there, she felt called to Rome. And that is where she went, and that's where she spends the rest of her life. She spends the next 2 decades trying to reform the church from Rome. She also founded her own monastic order. That is the picture that I have up. That's the costume for the nuns in her order. She ends up dying in 1373. The story of her canonization is kind of interesting. She was canonized quickly in 1391. However, it caused such controversy for a variety of reasons that due to like continued contentions, her canonization was actually confirmed 3 different times by 3 different popes. And even after all of that, there was still like a kind of a big level of disapproval within the church, definitely due to the fact like that she had been a married woman, definitely due to the nature of kind of how she operated, especially so politically, so public. So anyway, but that leads me to Catherine of Siena. She can almost be seen as a replacement for Birgitta in some ways. And I'm going to talk about how this happens. And Catherine ends up occupying a pretty similar role. Born in 1347, Catherine's early life is very typical for a saint. In fact, it's so typical, it seems to be very hagiographic. But there's also some pretty good scholarship on her as well. So I think we can imagine maybe a more realistic upbringing with her. She was the youngest of 25 kids. She had a twin, but her twin died. Hagiographic accounts claim she started seeing visions as a child. We do know that she rejected the idea of marriage, though she also refused to enter a convent. All right, so she's occupying kind of this liminal space, right? She isn't a nun, but she isn't really a lay person. She's often identified as a member of the Dominican Third Order, which is true enough, but it's probably not quite accurate. It's kind of complicated. I don't want to get into it. There really wasn't a Third Order of Dominicans in Siena at this point, but she does occupy this place as kind of as a holy lay woman, and she does become associated with the Dominicans, which is why I say it's probably accurate enough to call her that. Okay, so Catherine is often identified as middle class or kind of tradesman class. And she was, but she's middle class in the way that like St. Francis was middle class. Her family was not part of the nobility, but they had money and they had influence regardless. She was very well connected in Siena. She regularly conversed with the upper class. She was very much seen as a spiritual leader. She had followers. I have no doubt that she was incredibly charismatic. She had visions, she had rapture, she had all those kind of like typical late medieval mystical experiences you imagine. All right. She was very, very extreme in her asceticism to the point of self-harm. Her biographer, Raymond of Capua, who wrote her kind of most famous hagiography, was a prominent member of the Dominicans, and eventually he would become the master general of the entire Dominican order. This happened after her death. So when Birgitta dies, right, the Catholic Church was very much ready to pull Catherine into the church politics. All right, I know this seems strange that this young woman would come to occupy such a prominent place in the church, but I think there's also kind of a certain authority in her position. In a sense, she was an outsider, right? She's not part of the hierarchy, but she's also claiming to speak for God, and people believed her. Okay, they believed she was speaking for God. Now, she knew how to read. Apparently, she didn't know how to write. I don't know. I find this a little doubtful, but that's what the sources say. She does have a lot of extant letters that you can read. She also wrote a book or dictated a book called Dialogues. There is a reason I don't have you reading dialogues in this class. It is an absolute slog. Actually, so are Birgitta's writings and visions too. But our library has their stuff. If any of you are interested, it could be a fun final project or something. But anyway, I find both of these women to be such fascinating figures because they truly were able to gain a degree of authority and power through their mysticism. Okay, and I'm not implying their visions weren't genuine or anything like that, but I do find it fascinating. And it's like if you contrast them with somebody like Gregory the Great. All right, Gregory had authority because he was a man of noble rank. He had proved himself in the civic arena, right? He was drawn into political power not because of his mysticism, maybe almost in spite of his mysticism, right? Whereas somebody like Catherine, she didn't have power in this time or place. place, right? Yet she did gain it through her mysticism, through her holy lifestyle, okay? Speaking of her so-called holy lifestyle, she died at the age of 33. I'm pretty sure she starved herself to death. She was only eating communion wafers there at the end. All right, so on that fun note, I'm going to wrap up this video. Thanks, everybody.